guys, to another workshop from the Wellness Place. Welcoming Dr. Luke, who has
Thank you very much.
graciously volunteered his time to be available today as well. And we just thought that we talk a little bit more about some of the secrets of healthy living. Now, we titled the workshop some of the lessons from the Blue Zone and how to live to 100. But before we talk about that, let me pose a bit of a question to the group. If you had an opportunity to look at yourself a year before you turn 100, how would that look like? So when you're looking at yourself, you are 99 or you are 100, whatever you like to think. So let's talk about that. Just give me one thing that you see. So you are looking at yourself now?
Yeah.
How do you look like?
I think I'm pretty fit and pretty able, and if I was 99, I think I'd still like to be very aware and very be able to do what I wanted to do and get around by myself. That would be my prime thing.
Sure.
Not to have to be in care and being looked after, but be able to still do things for myself.
So you see yourself mentally alert and physically mobile.
Yeah.
Correct.
Yeah.
Nicely independent.
Yeah. How do you see yourself at 99 or 100? You said it's scary, so I want to know what scares you.
So I probably lost weight. I lose weight and I get a bit sick, so I'm just thinking I might lose weight and look a bit thin and dragged. But I'd still like to be physically mobile like you. I think everybody wants that. And mentally alert. I think if I'm not mentally alert and I'm really bad, and I certainly don't want to be here.
Sometimes it's even worse, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Julian, how do you see yourself at 99 or 100?
Yeah, still pretty, aware and able to understand what's going on, communicate and do things that I want to do. It's just hard to get there, because obviously I don't want to keep on, I want to be able to lose weight and be able to keep up a healthy lifestyle.
Sure.
Yeah.
You're not sure if you'll make it.
John, how do you feel, mate?
If I'm looking at myself at 99, I would have lost about a third of my existing weight. So I would come down to about 70 kilos or even less.
Okay.
And also be mentally alert.
Yes.
Because I'm always involved in a few different things, and that keeps you mentally alert. And being able to physically do for myself without having a great deal of outside help.
Okay.
Some outside help.
You're happy with some help. That's
Like
right.
cleaning lady.
I was going to say, it would be nice to have a cleaning lady in there.
There's a difference between the male and female perspective.
That's right. Yeah, you see.
I'm happy to
have help now. I think that's right. So before we talk, because that's a very good topic. Because one of the ladies I was speaking to before, and she said, because I said, you should come to this workshop, how to live to 100. And the first thing she said was, I don't want to live till I'm 100. And and I think that it's interesting because sometimes it depends how we correlate the number to what state of physical or mental health we perceive the 100 to be, because sometimes I like to think it's not about the number, it's more about the quality. But before we're going to get to that, why don't you tell us, because I know that intrigued a bit of question, what is the Blue Zone? Because a lot of people probably not even sure about what Blue Zone is. And while you're answering the Blue Zone, I'm just going to reduce a bit of noise over there and I'll come back. Okay?
Yeah, so the Blue Zones were these areas of the world that have been identified as having a remarkably high number of people who live to 100. So there was 5 of them identified in the world. There was Sardinia, was one. There was Okinawa in Japan. There was Nicoya in Costa Rica. There was I forget all five. Hang on,
What do they call that area there, Slovenia,
Ikaria.
places, Croatia, something in that area there, there's one around there.
Yeah, there's Ikaria, which is one of the Greek islands, which I was going to show you a video about. And I mentioned Okinawa in Japan. There's a place in America where the Seventh-day Adventists live as well.
Yeah.
And they also tend to be very health conscious and long lived.
So is this your way of preaching us to become Seventh-day Adventists? Is that?
I'm glad you could always.
It was on the telly yesterday.
Was it really?
Yeah.
About Seventh-day Adventists.
I didn't tell you that Luke is one of the elders from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. No.
I'm personally not very religious myself, but I find it fascinating. That is actually a common theme as
Very
well.
health-conscious,
Yeah.
very good.
Yeah, so basically these areas that it was identified, a lot of elderly people, particularly that are turning 100, and so they have been quite extensively studied and looking into their genetics and lifestyle, and it's turning out it's pretty much lifestyle.
And is this these elderly people? We're not talking about bedridden elderly people. We're talking about happy, standing up, walking around, mentally alert elderly people.
Playing table tennis at 85 and all that sort of thing.
Well, that's all working.
Because I was just going to say,
having jobs till they're 100, you know, farming and gardening and dancing and been very
it's very interesting, isn't it?
very sort of integral in the communities. Yeah.
Because it's very interesting because when you look at the orthodox medicine perception of health and medical care these days, they speak very proudly about the fact that we are prolonging life. You know, the fact that, I don't know, 100 years ago people would die at age 40, for example, and now they live till 80. But I wonder if we do, and this is, we haven't, by the way, rehearsed this question, so I wonder if they even think about amounts of medication people are on, what kind of state they're living till 80. Are they bedridden in a nursing home and lots of tubes, you know, attached to them? And hey, look, they're living till 80. You know, is this? Would you like to say anything about that?
And if you take Australia as an example, I mean, the average lifespan here. Do you know what that is at the moment?
No idea.
It's about 84, isn't it?
For women, it's about 84, yeah, and men is about 78, 79. So it's not even thought of about living to 100. This is, you know, and people who are living to 78, 79, you know, your typical male, they're not well for 20 years leading up to that. A lot of them have diabetes. I think about 40 to 50% of people have diabetes. And then diabetes leads to dementia and heart disease and blindness and deafness and having problems with your hands and feet, so you can't balance well. So this isn't like people who are living till 77 and then having a heart attack at 78.
No.
It's just people who are having a lot of health issues from their 30s, 40s, 50s, and it just continues to escalate until they pass away at a very young age, really, when you consider what the potential of a human lifespan really is.
So look, you mentioned about these people living well or not living well. How do you define healthy living?
So healthy living, I mean, I had a chat to my 4-year-old about this on a regular basis, and he could stand here and tell you what healthy living is. So we talk about healthy food, healthy water, healthy thoughts, healthy social, you know, having friends. We talk about healthy structure, which is where the chiropractic side of things and the exercise comes in, healthy movements, and so that would be the basic sort of, the recipe to health.
That's kind of triad of health, kind of, mental, emotional, physical, chemical.
And sleep of course as well. Yeah. So you can pretty much predict someone's health if you look at those factors and you say you're eating well, you're sleeping well, you're moving well, and you can predict someone's health 2 years, 5 years, 20 years from now based on that, and also on the social side of things. You know, how's the marriage? How's your friendship group? You can very easily predict what health is going to be like, but if you're only looking at lab work or, how's your knee going, you can't really predict much at all. That's more what we call episodic. So you come in, get a bit of treatment, get some drugs, get some whatever it might be, but it's not very, forward thinking.
Yeah. It's interesting you mentioned about the marriage. It's interesting. My wife, she likes to come in every few weeks or so, and she brings an article in front of me saying that, you see, married men live longer. So you need to make sure that you're not
Come home.
yeah. So it's interesting that she definitely uses that to her advantage as well in any time she can. Now, you did mention about people and diabetes and stuff like that. You mentioned some of the biggest killers at the moment in the world. Diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer. Now, I know what you and I think also there is an iatrogenic, which is death by medicine, but we're not going to talk about that today. But when we talk about some of these biggest killers, you did mention about trial of health, but then give me some pure examples of things that all of us we can live today to implement in our life to be able to prevent such diseases. I mean, the stuff that you mentioned, would that be fair? I mean, would you say that one matters more than the other to prevent cancer?
I'll give you a few examples. So I think, when I was researching what am I going to talk about in this talk, I was looking at, well, where are the people who live a long time and are happy and healthy? And I think they're the people we really need to learn from, because there's a lot of other research that is done on a very short-term basis, and it looks like, this is the latest fad, eat eggs, don't eat eggs, do CrossFit. But if you look at when people live a long time and don't have these chronic illnesses, there's very common themes that emerge. One of the really interesting studies I came across was called the Kitavan study, and it's quite an old study now. It's from 1994, and there was this Kitavan. So Kitava is a small island in Melanesia off the coast of Papua New Guinea, and it's a place that back in 1994 at least had not had really any contact with Western civilization.
I'll give it to you later on, Julian. That's fine.
So not a lot of influence anyway from Western lifestyle. And they went there to study them because they had heard anecdotally that there was no cardiovascular disease in this community. And so speaking to the doctors that live around that area, they confirmed that as well. And so there was a Swedish researcher that went and lived with them for 3 months, and he found they didn't have any cardiovascular disease. They also didn't have dementia. They also didn't have acne in the young people. So just an interesting side note. They also, some fascinating things about them is they would still have regularly people living into their 90s, even though they lived a very sort of hunter-gatherer type of lifestyle, which traditionally had been thought of as being quite harsh and causing people to die younger. But they had for me anyway, this was fascinating, their fasting insulin, which to my training is supposed to gradually go up over time. Theirs gradually went down. Do you
guys know what fasting insulin is?
Yes.
Okay.
So
could you explain that?
Fasting insulin is a hormone that you can measure in your blood, which controls the sugar. So if your sugar goes up, then insulin is produced to bring it down. And if you have over time higher fasting insulin means you're getting resistant to the effects of insulin, or your sugar is creeping up. So you need more.
So when you want to get tested, usually they will ask you to go in fasting and then check the insulin level. Yep.
So I just found it fascinating that it was even possible that this goes down over time. And it made me think, well, actually, this is probably normal. This is probably how it's supposed to be. It's supposed to go down over time gradually. And those people also had no increase in their girth, or what we call waist circumference. So over time, their waist circumference will be the same at 90 as it was at 15. And same at 50 as it was at 90. So then you look at, well, what do? And they actually live pretty relaxed lives. They're on a Melanesian island. They go do a bit of fishing. They come back, have a lay out in the sun. They're very active during the day. They have to forage all their food. They eat a lot of tubers like cassava and sweet potato. They have about 1.2 kilos of those a day. They also have a bit of food, or a bit of meat, a bit of like bats, and there's a few pigs running around, and
fish then.
Seafood, a bit of seafood, not predominantly though, like it's mostly plants. They also have a lot of just, fruit and herbs, and so really interesting how their blood sugar and all those sort of things track over time. So that's just one example. If you look at someone like in Ikaria, that video I was going to show you in the Greek island, the people who live the longest are actually the ones that live in the mountains. So they're not the ones sitting around not doing much. These are hard-working people. Like I watched a documentary about this area, and it had this 86-year-old farmer, and he had his 16-year-old nephew come and work with him, and he quit after 3 days. He said, it's too hard, I'm not doing this. And you watch this guy, and he gets up at 4 in the morning, and he just, out with the goats, he's up and down the mountains, he's, very wiry, strong man, but that's how they all are. And these are the ones that tend to live to 100. So the balance is amazing. Another example might be in Okinawa. Something I found interesting is they eat sitting down on the floor.
They do.
And they can get up and down without using their hands. They just up and down, they're very agile. And so that, one of the major things that results in death in Australian culture is falling and breaking a hip. And so the falling and breaking the hip isn't what kills you, but you end up in hospital, bedridden and getting pneumonia. So being able to prevent that is a massive benefit to longevity. So
We should stay out of hospital.
maybe we should sit there on the floor, I don't know. But you look at these practices and you think, well, we don't have to be mountain herders or,
Because I was going to say, is that your solution? We all going to move to Greek Islands?
Well,
Well, that's my plan, but that's all right.
There was a little thing on that television program I saw. He said your diet should be basically plant food based, or based on plants, and not sort of on.
Well, this is another interesting thing, because all those blue zones, they are mostly plant-based diets, but there's other areas in the world that aren't plant-based, but also have very similar demographics. So the Eskimos are the classic one.
Yes.
They don't have any plants.
No.
They eat blubber and seal and liver, and they have a very similar, very low rates before they were westernised. So plants aren't necessarily the answer, but I think the answer is eating. It's not a bad guide, but I think eating locally and eating seasonally and eating what is in your environment, and also how is the food produced. So if you're getting stuff that's very chemically processed, it doesn't matter if it's plants or animals, it's not good for you. And if it's coming in a packet and can last 30 years and doesn't go mouldy, it's probably not good for you. I'm not sure if that answers the question. I can get to the exact recommendations now if you like, but I thought we can revisit that later on. If
We can. I was going to dig in a little bit.
Jump into that now then, if it's a good time.
Do you want to talk about that? Yeah, sure.
So on the handouts you guys have, you don't have to go through them now, but I'll go through them with you, but you'll have this to take home. But there was a study called the Grant Study, and the Grant-Harvard Study, and this is, again, fascinating long-term study. So what they did is they started looking at a group of men who entered Harvard University as sophomores in 1938. And they've tracked them ever since, and they're still tracking them. There's a few still alive now. And so some of them are well into their 90s now, but they were looking for clues to health and happiness. So over the years, they've had a few studies produced every 10, 15 years on this, and their conclusions after however long it's been now, who's good at maths? 1938, it's a long time. So relationships seem to trump everything else when it comes to longevity, health and happiness. So, as much as smoking, drinking, all those other things are really important, you can predict someone's health at 50, and they even said this, they said that the age of, or at 50, I've written it down somewhere anyway, but it was something along the lines of the social, or the way you rate your relationships at age 50 is the most predictive thing for your health at age 80.
And relationship, you're talking about friends or
Marriage,
marriage?
kids,
Friends,
so marriage wants to be, if that's good, that helps. Relationship
You know,
with kids.
is that married or is that happy marriage?
It was, this is...
Because if you're in a poisonous marriage, then
Yeah.
that's not really going to be
No.
just counter-effective, isn't
It
it?
doesn't do you a lot of good.
No, even if you live a long time, it doesn't do a lot of good then.
Yeah.
But so it was a good marriage.
It's a good marriage, yeah?
It was, they talked about knowing your kids and being involved with your kids.
I think that's really important.
Yeah.
Because they're all different ages. And
Yeah.
to fit in, you've got to relate to them if you want to have a good
That's a
relationship.
good point. And they mentioned that with friends. They said friends of a broad age group.
Yeah.
I said stockpiling friends at a young age is a good idea, and keep doing that as a practice over your life. And that's something that I think is difficult in our modern world. We're becoming less socially reliant on each other and more isolated within this realm of social media and competitive materialism.
Yeah,
and
the sort of throwaway society in Australia is very, very consumer orientated. And very much like we've got a lot of huge amount of waste compared to a lot of places.
Sort of putting the priorities in the wrong area, isn't it? So we need more, we need a better car, need a bigger house, need the next whatever it might be.
Material things,
And material things make life better, there's no doubt about it. If I didn't have a fridge at home, then life wouldn't be quite as easy. If there wasn't a dishwasher, if there wasn't a phone, these things do make life easier, but at the same time, there is a downside to technology and making that reliance on society and community less and less, and people becoming more alienated and lonely, and that's definitely a strong predictor of poor health. When those factors are playing out. So that's number one. So the other thing that's along the same lines, and again, it's not a physical thing, but more an emotional, mental thing, is having a purpose. So when we looked at the Okinawan group, so that was another one in Japan where they live, I think they have the women in Okinawa live longer than anywhere else on the planet. So a good one for the girls to pay attention to. But in Okinawa they have a concept called Maui, which means purpose. So you ask an Okinawan, they will all know why they're getting out of bed in the morning. And this is just a philosophy of life they're all drummed into from day one. So it's something they don't even have to think about, they know it already.
Interesting.
When you're, 97 and you can tell someone, I'm getting out of bed for these reasons, that's a very strong predictor of good health. Because it tends to drive behaviours that are healthy, but it also, probably the brain and mind is communicating that through your body and saying, it's not time to go just yet, we've got a lot to do.
Yes.
There's a lot to be done, there's a lot to be achieved, we've got the grandkids to worry about and this to go on. And so that purpose, having a very strong purpose in life.
And it doesn't have to be a big goal, I don't think, just as you're saying it's emotional.
Just has to be, if someone asks you, just has to be, if you're asked, why are you getting out of bed? They don't blink and they'll tell you. Even if it's because, someone's got a plan for me. But, I think most Westerners would struggle and balk at that question. It'd be nice to say that most would have a very clear answer, but I found that was a very interesting aside.
It's very interesting, actually.
In Costa Rica, exactly the same. They call it plan de vida, and same thing. It's this philosophy around purpose, and it's ingrained in the community and culture. So that would be the number 2 thing I'd have on my list there. So again, setting goals, knowing why you're getting out of bed in the morning. Diet's massive. So you can, I tell this to my kids. I say, if you eat unhealthy food, you're getting sick. Bad food makes you sick. Healthy food makes you healthy. It's that simple. And it's not about have a bit of a cheat day. No, that's making you sick. The less you have of that, the better. The more healthy stuff. So I see food as nourishing and fuel and sustaining life. And if you're getting food which is not doing that, it's taking from life. And it's a massive influence on health. Probably with sugar being the number 1 offender there, along with alcohol and processed foods. So that then leads on to what to avoid with diet. So it's one thing saying let's eat healthy foods, but I think it's just as important about avoiding, the smoking, drinking, processed foods, sugar. And it's so easy way to lower. Put it in your if you don't put it in, your sugar can't go up. And there's certain foods that do not have any influence on your blood sugar whatsoever. If you're eating a lot of plants, for example, and meats and fats, and even very the tubers like sweet potato and cassava and these sort of things, these are very low glycemic. They don't raise your blood sugar. So I think that's one of the best tips for longevity as well. So exercise. Again, if you look at these people who live a long life, as we talked about, they're often goat herders in the mountains, or live very physically difficult lives. And I don't want to do that. I have no desire to be a goat herder in the mountains, and I probably don't have the work ethic to do what they do, but I exercise every day.
But you, yes.
Yeah, and I maintain a level of activity that I think is enough to sustain health and longevity. And
Is there a type of exercise that you would recommend people to do
yes,
more?
if you want to, and again, there's different exercise for different purpose. So if your purpose is to be the Olympic athlete, you want to do that sort of training. If your purpose is you want to live to 100 and be happy and healthy and surrounded by your family, and they're nothing.
No.
They're doing regular during the day. It's the housework, it's the gardening, it's the
And
farming.
it's every day.
Every day, yeah, every day. Yeah, and it's not, someone else doing it for them.
No.
These are fiercely independent people. I was watching another video on the Costa Rican group who, very long lived, and there was a 97-year-old, and he was showing the guy who's doing the video about how he wields the machete and how he chops down the trees as they're growing up and gets rid of the weeds. And he shows the young people in his community how the most efficient way of using the machine. So he feels that that's a very important thing for him. Every day he's out with the machine. So you can't imagine. I find it hard to imagine some of the very sort of 90s and plus people that I've met.
To be able to do that, yeah, that's right, yes.
But if they give it up, I think that's the trouble. Western society sort of gives up that level of
It comes back to that purpose, doesn't it? So if you're waking up in the morning saying, well, not at my age, then what do you think your behaviours are going to reflect?
I hear a lot of people saying that, I'm too old for that now.
You hear people in their 30s saying that.
Yes.
That's a really
It's a very nice
insidious sort of mindset.
Very.
And it happens, we see a very skewed group of the population who often have injuries and pain and dysfunction. But how many times have you seen someone even in their 20s say, I'm just getting older. I'm just, I'm not as able as I was when I was 16. This is just ridiculous.
Yeah.
But that mindset will actually cause those traits to manifest. And it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So, and I think that's why having those two at the top in the number 1 and 2 reasons being those social constructs and your purpose and mindset, because that then everything else flows from there, doesn't it? So the other things I've got here would be maintaining a healthy weight, which again goes along with those exercise and diet, healthy sleep, and the time in nature. And another interesting one would be education. So there was another study I was reading which was looking at some inner city, it was in an American community again, another sort of 30-year study, and it was looking at the same sort of thing, the health, happiness, in a group of inner city urbanites who were very lower socio-economic group. And the most predictive thing for them in terms of health, happiness and longevity was the level of education they managed to attain. So I think that's probably a very important factor as well.
And continue to learn.
Yeah, having that. I think it's a mindset of curiosity.
Taking different things on as a challenge.
So having that mindset of a student rather than
There are a couple of things I wanted to ask you. One probably relatively simple, and then the other one is about the mindset. The first one I wanted to ask you was, there is quite a bit of a talk in fact at the moment about the paleo diet, for example, which I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with that or not, but everyone talks about, there are cookbooks about paleo diet, and that's a healthy way of living, reduces your cholesterol and diabetes and everything else as well. Would you, I know this is a bit of a digress from this conversation, but just talking about that, would you elaborate a little bit more about how that fits in to this healthier living as well?
Yeah, well, I love the paleo diet because it's got a philosophy. It's saying that we don't want to eat certain foods because they're not part of our makeup and they're not part of what we've evolved to eat. It's like looking at a koala and saying, well, let's try it on some meat. Let's see how it goes if we give it some corn. We know full well if a koala, even if it doesn't have the right type of gum leaf off the same tree, you can kill a koala by giving it the wrong leaves on that tree. So it's such a specialised diet, and I think it's it does make sense to me that we've also specialised to have certain types of foods to eat. So do you know what a straw man argument means?
No, weak.
Basically weak, it means you are building up a weak argument so you can smash it down easily. So you say, you know, I don't agree with the paleo diet because the paleo diet is one that's so high in meat that has to be bad for you, so that's a stupid diet to eat. So you've built up a false premise, so you can knock it down to support an argument which is flimsy or isn't truthful really if you look at the entire sphere of evidence around it. So I mean, if I was looking at that Katahdin study, I was saying that's probably a good example of a Paleolithic diet, you know, what they would have done 10,000 years ago on that island, because they haven't really changed anything. So in Katahdin, they ate a little bit of meat, but they ate a lot of sweet potatoes and cassava and fruit and just whatever was on the island, they'd eat it. You know, if they had wheat there, they'd eat it. If they had legumes there, they'd eat it. A religious practice, but if it's in like the Katahdins, you know, fasting happens because there was no pig. They didn't find one that day, so they're just eating plants and nothing else that day. But in Icaria, so they're very staunch Greek Orthodox religious people there. So on Wednesdays and Fridays, they don't eat meat, they don't have red wine, which is, you know, they don't have alcohol, and they don't have olive oil. So they're basically eating nothing but plants. Some of them don't eat anything those days. Some of them are very strict. And then they have long periods of fasting as well, like a week before Lent. And it's several of these, and it turns out to be almost 50% of the year in that island that they're actually fasting. So I mean, how many Australians would consider that, you know, they miss lunch and they're starving, you know, I can't handle this.
That's right. That's right. Yes.
Lately there's the fast diet, 2 days not eating so much.
Oh yes.
The 2 and 5, the 2 and 5. There are many of them. 2 and 5.
So this is
it's called a fast diet, but there is only a period of fasting in there that you nominate.
Yeah.
And you stick to or you change accordingly.
So I do something similar. I don't actually fast the whole day, but I probably 3 or 4 days a week. I don't eat
as
much.
much as you want.
I don't eat until about 12, 1 o'clock.
If you're not hungry, you don't eat.
I don't eat anything. Don't eat anything. Just have water until about 12, 1 o'clock, and then I still have the same amount of food. So I have my breakfast, lunch, and dinner in about 8 hours. And that way, in that 16-hour window when I'm not eating, my body learns how to use up the stored fuel. So it learns how to switch onto burning fat instead of burning sugar. Because if you always have food in your mouth, your body always uses sugar to burn fuel and to create energy. If you don't always have sugar in your bloodstream, it learns how to use fat. And so if your body never does that, it doesn't learn how to use fat effectively. And that's when you miss a meal and you feel moody and grumpy, and that means you're not fat adapted, which means you can't actually burn your fuel that you've taken on board. So that fasting does allow that to happen.
People with diabetes, you know, that the risk of falling if you have a low blood sugar or something.
Well, that's more, that's definitely a factor, and that needs to be managed. But if you stop raising insulin so often, so sugar raises insulin, and if you stop doing that on a regular basis, the insulin levels start to decrease, so you get more tolerance. So I listened to a podcast recently, and they were talking about the history of diabetes. And diabetes started out not being called diabetes, they called it carbohydrate intolerance. And what they would do is they'd see someone with the telltale signs, like the sweet urine and the, you know, peeing all the time and really thirsty, and they'd say, all right, it sounds like you have this problem. And what they would do before insulin was discovered was they would say, all right, we're going to remove all the carbohydrates 100%. And this, you know, to frame this works beautifully. It still works. It used to work before the drugs were discovered. It still works now. And they take away all the carbohydrates 100%, so they're just eating like meat and veg and water, nothing else. They'd add it back 10 grams at a time. So they'd say, you know, Julian, you're going to only have 10 grams of carbohydrates today. And then they'd measure your urea, your urine, all those measurements they had back in the day. And what they would do is they would, at 10, so you might get up to 40, 50, 60 grams of carbohydrates. And then everything started to go haywire. And they'd say, look, 50 grams of carbohydrates is your limit. That's all you're allowed. You can't tolerate any more, you'll die if you have more than that. And that was the treatment for diabetes. And then in, I think it was 1919, insulin was discovered, and the pendulum flipped, and they said, your sugar's too high, we've got a drug for you. And so the emphasis went right off diet and onto the medications, and now we have I think it's like 48 different medications that lower blood sugar. And what they do is they make you wee out more sugar. It's ridiculous. You know, if you stop taking it in, why do you need to wee more out?
Very true. Very
So
true.
so the concept that Luke's talking about is called intermittent fasting as well, which are many different types of intermittent fasting. But needless to say, of course, some of these topics that we mentioned here about fasting and diabetes management will strongly encourage you to discuss to your medical professionals as well. And,
it's very controversial as well, and there is a risk. You know, you can't just try to fix everything and go off medication, because once you're diabetic, you've got a serious medical condition. But what I'm talking about is largely how to prevent that getting to that stage and maintain health. So if you're not over-consuming the carbohydrates, you won't develop the resistance to insulin, which then leads to diabetes, the medical complaint that then needs to be very carefully monitored. But I was going to mention as well, I was saying about carbohydrate intolerance and that 50 grams, because that was about the average they were talking about when people would say, look, you can't handle more than 50 grams. Do you know how much carbohydrate is in one slice of bread? 41 grams.
I was just going to think probably about 30, but it's 41.
So if you think about your average diabetic and how much carbohydrate they're consuming, do you think they're having too much? I mean, I think they're probably having a lot more than
one slice of bread.
One slice of bread. So.
All right, I was gonna come back because I know we're getting, I'm not sure what the time is, but hopefully you're enjoying the conversation so far. And, well, I'm just going to ask you just a couple more questions, and then I'll come back to another topic I was going to talk to you about, which was more about mindset. But I just want to get through these couple of questions I had. You mentioned about the body functioning well, so would that be your sugar level, would that be your gut, would that be your liver, all this kind of stuff as well. So what kind of test would you recommend people undertaking to be able to really find out how, I mean, like right now I'm sitting here, I may define myself as healthy or unhealthy, it doesn't really matter how I define myself, but if I want to truly know how my body is going, because a lot of time as well, just on that note, we know what we know. So for example, I may think that getting a headache once a week is normal, or the fact that I get about bloating is normal, or the fact that I've got this, that's normal, because either I've had it for a long period of time and I've got used to it, or people that I'm associated with who potentially are the same as I am, they've got the same problem. So I see it as a normal thing, right? So if I wanted to know truly how I'm functioning, what kind of tests can I undertake, and who would do those tests, and what do they show?
So there's an endless number of tests that you can get run these days, and I was thinking about it from the lens of longevity, because it depends on what you're trying to measure as well. So there'd be different tests if it wasn't longevity that you'd be looking at. But there's a test that can be done now called telomere length. Has anyone heard of telomere length?
No.
Anyone heard of telomeres? So you've heard of chromosomes.
Yes.
So chromosomes are the DNA in the nucleus of the cell, where all your proteins are made as the blueprint of. So on the tips of those chromosomes, it's kind of like a shoelace, has that little tip on the end with the tape wrapped around it. The chromosome has the same sort of thing, that as the cells are dividing, that little tip gets a little bit of damage. So the more it divides, the more damage that little tip tends to accumulate. The little tip of the chromosome we call it a telomere, and then you've got different enzymes and things to repair it. But the rate at which that telomere is breaking down and getting shorter and shorter predicts longevity quite nicely. So you can actually measure this now. You can get swabs of your cheek where they look at the cells in your cheek, and they can have a look and see, well, how short are your telomeres, and they relate that back to a group of people your age and see where your sort of telomere age is.
Yeah, the thing is, for instance, I take after my father, and he died at 73 of a heart attack. My brother and I, take after my father.
Yeah. So genetics, you're asking about that probably. So how big a factor is that? It's a factor. It's one factor. But if you look at all those blue zone areas, there is groups of people who live side by side with those people with the same lineage, the same genetics, who die young. And then you have these, same genetics, and they live till they're 100. And the difference is lifestyle. And it's the things that we were talking on, those, social things, the diet, the exercise.
Yeah.
So genetics it does play a role, but it's not as big as some people might have thought, and it can be heavily influenced.
Yeah.
So with your dad's genes, you can still be healthier than he was, and you can still be sicker than he was, depending on the choices you're making. So yeah, the telomere length will be
So that will tell you the real age and real kind of damage you have inside.
Yeah.
Is there another test or two you like to recommend as well?
Always loads. I love tests.
Yeah, you love tests, that's right.
So another one with fasting insulin. I mentioned that before.
Yeah.
If you look at the diseases, we have that average lifespan of 78 to 84 in Australia. And if you look at the top causes of people dying in Australia, number one is cardiovascular disease, a heart attack. Number two is dementia. That's recently overtaken number three, which is, I think it's cancer. It's either cancer or stroke. They're both thereabouts. But cardiovascular disease is pretty much a complication of diabetes for most people who get that. There's a lot of other causes of it, but there's a huge number of people who are diabetic who end up dying of heart attacks. If you look at the numbers, that's a really strong correlation.
What are your views about statins?
Well, I'm not allowed to have views about statins because it's a prescription medication, so yeah, I'm not allowed an opinion. Can't comment on prescription medication.
No.
I think it's a bit over the top though.
But I think it's what we can tell you is the fact that people who have got healthy habits, they have less, obviously, cardiovascular issues, which means that less cardiovascular problem and complication, less need for statins as well. Would that be fair to say?
I'm not sure. I've got no opinion on statins. So.
So we're basically, obviously that's a topic that you want to discuss with your medical professional as well. So we don't actually have an opinion on that.
Fasting insulin. So again, if you looked at the Katavan study, so that was a Swedish researcher. So he was comparing the Swedish information, and he was looking at age-matched people. And at every age, he found the fasting insulin about 50%. It's the Katavan versus the Swedish person. The Swedes are generally very healthy. So Swedes aren't, southern states of America, all hugely obese and whatever else. They're quite a healthy control group. And to have that 50% less fasting insulin, I thought was very significant, especially for a population where heart disease and diabetes are non-existent. It's not low incidence, it doesn't happen. It just didn't happen. They didn't have a word for it. They'd never even heard of someone having chest pain. So they were trying to ask them about, what about, working hard, getting chest pain, and like, what?
What is that?
Why would someone get that? So, whereas, not really an issue finding someone who's heard of someone having chest pain here. So that'd be the first two. So another few would be, there's another test called coronary calcium score.
Yes.
It's not commonly done. I think Faye, I might have mentioned that one to you
You
before.
have, it's on my list to do.
So what coronary calcium score is, it is probably as important as cholesterol, if not more important, and it's an independent risk factor for heart disease. And what it means is you're looking at how much build-up is happening in the arteries of the heart, specifically the heart, so coronary calcium. So the build-up of calcium tends to relate to build-up of muck and hardening of the arteries, which we call that atherosclerosis. So that's probably a term you've heard of. Atherosclerosis leads to heart disease. So the best way of measuring atherosclerosis and build-up of calcium in the arteries is a coronary calcium score, and I'll give you a number between 0 and whatever the number is. 0 to 400 is the reference range normally. I had a patient the other day come back at 582. I've seen patients over 1,000. And your risk over 400 of a heart attack is getting reasonably high. I had mine tested, it was 0, I was happy with that. I had another patient yesterday who was 0, and she's in her 60s, so she was pretty happy with that. So it doesn't have to go up over time, but it tends to. Most people you do see it creeping up.
So these tests, these three tests, and thank you for that. These three tests, do patients need to come and see you to get that done? Can they do it through your GPs?
You could get it, like the telomere testing, you could get done through any savvy practitioner, but not many have heard of telomeres. So, I can...
Is that covered on Medicare if they want to go to GP? No, it's not. potentially coming to someone like yourself, that would be helpful.
If you wanted to know your biological age through your DNA, then that would be a great test to get done.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then your coronary calcium.
So that one does get done medically.
Okay.
It's not done as often as I would suspect it should be done for the, I guess, for the groups who are prone to cardiovascular disease.
Can you request it if you go?
Oh yeah. If you request it, I'll do it.
So,
I've never had a patient, because I talk about this test quite often, because as a chiropractor we're taking x-rays and I see calcium build up in arteries all the time. So I say you've got to get that checked in the heart and see is that a problem. And it always is. If I see it on the arteries in the lower back,
Yeah,
or
you
the neck,
would expect that to be.
it's everywhere. It's everywhere. It's going to be in the heart as well.
And then, so that can be done through the GP if they wanted to. Is that covered under the GP? Or?
If you have evidence of heart disease in the family or another marker like cholesterol or blood pressure, then I think it can be, and the specialist it will be covered, but it's usually about $150.
Okay, so it's not that expensive either anyway. And then the last one was your insulin.
Insulin, yeah.
That's covered on the Medicare over there.
Yeah,
Is that correct?
that's a very common
Can you
one.
order that as well if you wanted to?
Look, but I think that's that's
Something
part of
you
general
do.
medical.
That's right.
Yeah, it's just
So I'm just going to throw, if you guys don't mind, just a couple of more minutes, and then we just do one more question, which I think is quite important, and then we'll wrap it up with this. A lot of the information that we discussed today, hopefully you found it interesting, but none of those kind of information we discussed today, especially about the happy, healthy living, would be something that people potentially have never heard of. The social media and the technology these days and websites, it's very easy to get access to that information, which takes me back to what can we do to maintain that? I think the maintenance is an issue. I mean, a lot of times I may have heard about all this, but why it doesn't get implemented in my life, or if it gets implemented, why do I opt out after a week or two? Which I will probably go to the second point of your recommendations, which was the purpose, which is a mindset. And I think a mindset potentially plays a very important part in the total picture, because even your mindset can attract friends. Mindset can inspire people to be in your circle, and mindset can make you feel happy or sad about certain things, or mindset can give you a different perception about your finances and the belongings and attachment to the material world and all this kind of stuff as well anyway. So what can we do to follow these recommendations, these 8 or 9 recommendations that you have, and what can we do to maintain that so we don't necessarily go, yeah, that sounds really good, okay, I'm going to go and get some new friends, or I'm going to get out of sugar for the next few days, and then next week I'm back again having fun slices of toast and everything else that I might be.
I think it's kind of like the Okinawans get out of bed and don't miss a beat, they know why they're getting out of bed. And I think it's not something that's encouraged in growing up in Australia about focus on what's your purpose, what's your mission, what's your higher reason for being here. I think that sort of thing needs to be driving all those other behaviours. Because if you don't, like that person you said, well, I don't want to live to 100. Can't think of anything worse. So that's not a great outlook on life really if you're thinking that. So I think getting very clear on why would you want to be healthy? For what good will that do you or anyone around you? And if you can come up with that and it can roll off the tongue and be very front of your mind, then you're going to start looking, well, I've got a pretty good reason now. Why don't I start eating better? Because I'm not going to make it. The earlier you start taking care of your physical body, that pays dividends. So if you get diabetes when you're 30, the chances of living to 100 are probably not going to be there at all, as opposed to if you never get diabetes or if you maintain a healthy weight. I think the purpose is the big one.
Purpose, big one.
So what do you think? I mean, you've
I
thought about this as well.
Absolutely.
How some people end up with a strong reason for being, and others
I think so, yeah.
sort of floundering.
About a few months ago, guys, I don't know if you know this, but I ran a life map workshop as well, and that was about similar to what we're discussing, more about the purpose, more about the mindset, more about knowing where you're heading, and I really think that makes a huge difference. Kind of clarifying your head. And one thing that I've discovered sometimes I've been a bit lost is simply because you get so busy and so consumed in a day-to-day activities that it was funny. I was having this conversation yesterday with a colleague, and we were just saying, you may find this very dumb to say, but I don't have enough time to think. And it sounds really stupid because you go, well, you can think all the time, but really having that time allocated to sit down and put a pen to paper, not just thinking, because a thought can become reality when it's actually written down and visualized and thought of, and thought about, that you can actually then transform it into an action. But I think it's just having that mindset clear, know what your vision is, what your purpose is, what is a game, you know, what's a game plan is, because that then clarifies and crystallizes your action plan, you know. Because if your vision is very obscure, then you just go whichever way the wind comes, really, you know, and you get influenced by the next whatever ad that might be about the diet or ice cream or an activity. But if you're very clear, then it's going to be very, you know, you can focus and narrow it down and follow a path that's very crystallized. Yeah.
I think another point on that is if you look at just the strength of relationships in people that end up living to 100, that's often their purpose.
Yeah.
So cultivating that provides them the reason, you know, they've got dominoes at midnight to keep playing, and you know, they're going to be doing so many things with their friends and family, and them being that support and mentor and the wisdom they bring to those relationships and the joy they get from them is their reason for being.
Yeah.
So sometimes just, you know, stepping back and being all on your own with a purpose, that's pretty tough too.
Yeah, true.
So really trying to collaborate more and trying to just really cultivate those friendships, and I think that helps as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think the respect that younger people have or don't have for elderly people, and I think in Western society that's disappearing a bit.
Yeah.
So you have,
Which again goes back to the mindset and kind of that clarity,
Yeah.
man, you know?
Yeah, we don't want to live it too long, pitching the inheritance.
I'm spending it.
Alright, well, Luke, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate that. Guys, hopefully you enjoyed the workshop as well. We'll put this on our website, and some of those points as well we'll turn into different blogs and put into our newsletters. So check out the space, and